My name is Kissane and this is my EUB420 context analysis. A problem prevalent to the Australian curriculum is teacher avoidance of discussing controversial materials in English classrooms, which, according to the Australian Human Rights Commission, include Indigenous people's rights, queer rights, women's rights, and homelessness. Cairns argues that controversial issues are often viewed as a societal problem exogenous to schools, and, as stated by Kissane, Oosterhout, and Maisha, even when controversial issues are part of the syllabus, teachers will avoid teaching them, which Macpherson argues is to maintain neutrality of schools. Because of this avoidance, many school settings are situating value-laden topics in what Eisner defines as the null curriculum, referring to concepts and skills which are not made available to students. For example, author Beniba Clark argues books taught in schools often render marginalized individuals invisible, which intersects with Dearden's claim that ignoring controversial issues misrepresents subjects as monolithic and ahistorical. The danger of avoiding controversial materials in English classrooms can be summarized by Britzman's Violence of Innocence, wherein avoidance reproduces the dominant ideology as the desirable ideology. This is an issue prevalent to the Australian curriculum because by Year 10, literature substrands ask students to evaluate social, moral, or ethical positions, and the general capability of ethical understanding details an ability to analyze ethical perspectives on contemporary issues. Because controversial material is avoided, students are not provided with well-rounded conceptualizations or skills to consider varying perspectives of social groups on current issues, and therefore fail to meet these curriculum areas. Davies and Buzzacott agree, arguing ethical transformation is no longer a priority in Australian schools. To determine the root causes of this curriculum problem, I used the entrepreneurial thinking technique of problem validation outlined by James P. Davis, wherein I unpacked my assumptions about the problem by asking the question why several times to generate a list of reasons the problem has occurred. Many sources of literature agree that teachers avoid controversial material as they feel they lack the expertise and skills to deliver content on complex issues. From this, I asked, why are teachers worried about being experts? I considered the assumed view that teachers need to be the epicenter of knowledge in the classroom and found that most adults are accustomed to the hierarchical model of teacher as dictator and the factory model of education, wherein teachers are the dominant and fill the empty minds of children. I then asked, why was the teacher as dictator model established in education systems? This idea stems from the industrialization of mass schooling, when schools were used as an obedience instrument to supply capital with compliant labor, engineering education for productive economic utility rather than emancipatory empowerment. This urged consideration of why schools were intended to hinder free thought and liberation. In an Australian context, schools were and continue to be perpetuated as an assimilationist dynamic, as the persistence of colonialism structurally maintains stigma against marginalized groups and upholds Eurocentric worldviews. Many sources agree that the avoidance of controversial materials in classrooms have drastic implications on learner needs, arguing that engaging in controversial issues is an important identity task which has an essential role in enhancing democratic engagement, developing critical thinking skills, and successfully transitioning from adolescence to adulthood. Sanjakta concurs that exploring controversial curriculum content teaches students to deal with conflict in their personal lives, and the removal of these topics from the English classrooms can result in learners who do not develop skills to actively listen, empathize, or change their opinions in light of new information. The avoidance of controversial materials also results in excessive adverse effects on marginalized children, particularly Indigenous students. Although inclusion of texts by First Nations Australian authors are embedded throughout the English curriculum, and the APSTs signify teachers need to know how to teach, understand, and respect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, these policies remain vague and undefined in terms of inclusivity and diversity, and therefore the effectiveness of their current implementation is often superficial as teachers avoid practically engaging with them. Omitting opportunities for Indigenous students to see themselves reflected in curriculum leads to negative concept of self, a greater distrust of authority, and a sense of powerlessness and exclusion from the broader community. As a result, they are more likely to be school avoiding or leave high school at an earlier age in order to flee expected assimilation and seek identity-affirming spaces elsewhere. This is evident in statistics, as in 2024 the retention rate of Indigenous students between Year 10 and 12 was 57% compared to the Australian average of 80%. My innovation idea is the implementation of a class protocol for having democratic discussions about controversial material in a Year 10 classroom. This protocol would be tailored to a particular class, co-constructed by students, teachers, and relevant stakeholders, and could detail appropriate language, content, expectations, and boundaries for these discussions. Logistically, this protocol may look like a written agreement with posters around the classroom, and time would need to be allocated for consultation, development, and implementation processes. This innovation addresses colonial bias as through collaborative efforts between communities and educational institutions, a holistic approach towards addressing the diverse needs of students is promoted. The protocol also moves away from the teacher as dictator perception, because underpinning any attempts to shift the task of planning from something teachers do for students to something teachers do with students is a belief in the importance of student voice and student agency, and students are empowered when they have input in how they learn. Engaging in a collaborative model of discourse has potential to align with language and literature curriculum descriptors by metacognitively teaching students how language can have inclusive and exclusive social effects, and how to reflect on and extend others' interpretations of and responses to literature, and would give these students the perspectives to evaluate ethical positions that they currently don't have. Other than teachers and students, guardians, English heads of departments, year-level coordinators, and school counsellors would also be stakeholders in the co-construction of this protocol, although importantly the agreement would be classroom-specific and stakeholders would vary according to context. These stakeholders would need to be willing to contribute their time to a consultation process and commit to following an agreed protocol. An opportunity available to this innovation is the increasing diversity of communities leading to approval of inclusive and community-responsive initiatives, as well as opportunity for more heterogeneous perspectives available in the classroom. Furthermore, guardian and community involvement in schools has also become an encouraged priority in recent years. However, a key constraint of this innovation is that priorities of the involved stakeholders may reflect the same colonial bias current in the school system. Furthermore, in diversifying school communities where polarized worldviews are commonplace, a potential constraint is that stakeholders could struggle to come to a collective agreement on the protocol.